Hello, my name is Tyrion Havard and I'm a senior lecturer at London South Bank University, and today I'm going to be talking about mobile phones and domestic abuse. The title of the presentation is How Mobile Phones Assist Perpetrators in Maintaining Power and Coercive Control over their current and former partners. So a little bit about me. As I've said, I'm a senior lecturer at London South Bank University. I'm a qualified social worker, but my practice background was in the probation service, and an awful lot of the people I worked with, almost all of the people I worked with, were perpetrators of domestic violence. And that became apparent the more I learned about domestic abuse. So it wasn't obvious necessarily from their index offence, but further investigation showed that so many of my offenders were perpetrators. I've recently completed my PhD at the University of Sussex, and it's my PhD research that I'm going to be drawing on today, though there may be aspects of my probation practice that's influenced this research. So what I did as part of this research is I interviewed women survivors of domestic abuse who were housed in refuges at the time. I wanted to know if and how mobile phones had influenced their experience of abuse. And the reason that I chose survivors in refuges is because research suggests to us that those at the extreme end of abuse tend to go to, that women in refuges tend to have experienced the most extreme levels of abuse. And so I was more likely to find survivors of coercive control within that population. This research does look specifically at the male abuse of women. So these are women in heterosexual relationships and within intimate relationships. I want to be clear that I understand that abuse happens from women to men and within same-sex relationships. But because I was interested in the power dynamics, I wanted to keep this population stable. Throughout the research, I may have a tendency to refer to perpetrators as men and survivors as women, but that's a reflection of the research and the reading that I've been doing around the subject. So please excuse me, and please, if I do say male instead of perpetrator, do interpret that as being open to also all genders. Just to reassure you, the names of all the people in this, I will be drawing on my research. I will be quoting the women who I interviewed. I've changed their name to conceal their identity. And it's also worth noting that much of what I've been told and many of the stories that were shared with me are very difficult to hear and can be quite traumatic. So just for you to bear that in mind when you're listening. Okay, so the structure of this session is I'm going to begin by reviewing the literature to see if we can understand what is meant by coercive control. Because if we don't really understand what it is, it's going to be difficult to identify and work with it. I'm then going to be drawing directly onto my research and listen to the women's experiences of how men used mobile phones in their coercive control. So this is very much unadulterated, raw data from the women. The next step is when I start to interpret this information and start to look at the responses to coercive control, and specifically within the context of mobile phone technologies. And it's my outline, my conclusion really is that I do think domestic abuse is changing because of technology, and I hope to be able to persuade you of that and to make you more aware of that in your practice. And then the very last thing that I'll be doing is looking at practice from a probation angle really, but also taking into account the women's stories and what they were telling me. I'd very much like this to be an interactive session and a way to share good practice. So if you are doing things, if you are using mobile phones in your assessments or in your interventions, then I'd be really grateful if you could share that with me, and then I can pass this on to other seminars, webinars and teaching that I do. So, beginning with a theoretical account of coercive control. So, many of you here will be familiar with this power and control wheel. It's the Duluth, Minnesota model, but it's worth going through it again because it really underpins an awful lot of what I'm doing. So this theory is a feminist-based theory and believes that at the heart of all abuse is the need or the intention to have power over somebody and control their behaviour. And so in the hub of this wheel, we have power and control. Around the outside, we have all the different techniques that perpetrators use to maintain this power and control. So if we start at 1 o'clock, they use intimidation. And so that can be things like calling names, making people feel bad about themselves, degrading them, and threatening them. Many of the behaviours that I describe will fit into more than one of these categories. So I'm just giving examples for each one for you to get a sense, but it should be seen holistically. So using emotional abuse is very much about name calling. It's about degrading people again. So it's about picking, saying that they're fat, saying that they're stupid, saying that they're ugly, saying all sorts of things. Isolation is also a tactic that's used. So perpetrators will separate survivors from their families and friends, and they will use lots of very creative ways to do this. Perpetrators also minimise, deny and blame their behaviour. So they deny that they're doing or blame the survivor for that. And this is something that I came across enormously as a probation officer. So I would be told things like, oh, it wasn't that bad. Survivors may have suffered broken bones, but it wasn't that bad. I have been told more times than I can remember that women like to be beaten. And I've also been told things like, she started the argument, she provoked me into doing it, and even using the menstrual cycle as an explanation to why they needed to become violent. Children are often used in domestic abuse situations, so they can carry messages from one parent to the other, but they're also used as a tool sometimes. So if you do this, I'll take the children away. And we're seeing a lot of this now coming to light through the family courts and the domestic abuse bill, which is going through Parliament, or was before a new election was started, is looking to address that. But for now, using children is still very, very common. And so they'll carry messages. Children will be told that their mum is useless, or children will be used to try and find women once they've left an abusive relationship. Male privilege, because this is a feminist model, male privilege is significant in this. And so it believes that the feminist model believes very strongly in the idea of hierarchy and patriarchy in particular. And so what this argues is that men have a sense of privilege, that they believe that they should be waited on, that they are the master of their castle, and that they are superior in many ways to their female partners. Economic abuse is also important, and this used to be called financial abuse, but again, there are plans to change that in the domestic abuse bill. So economic abuse might be not giving people money, or giving them such a small amount of money that it's really impossible to feed the family on it. And this is something that I came across quite often as a probation officer. And I worked with one perpetrator whose partner, it took every time she went shopping, she had to produce the change and the receipt to the penny to show every penny that she had spent. And if she lost some money out of her purse, or it fell on the floor, or there was incorrect change, she would be physically and sexually punished for that. And finally, we've got the use of coercion and threats, and that's sort of the heart, really, of this presentation today. And so that's really about threatening people and doing sort of quite silent things, and we'll explore that a bit more as we go on. What might be of interest to you is that increasingly in academic circles, the power and control wheel is being called the coercive control wheel. And also originally when Ellen Pence did this, Pence and Painmar created this in the 90s, there were originally 10 sections. The two that they took out was random acts of kindness and sexual violence. And I understand that these were taken out because the wheel looks nicer and more aesthetically pleasing with just 8 segments and not 10. So if we look at the power, so in the heart of this wheel, at the hub of this wheel, we have this need, desire and intention to control their partners and to have power over them. We've got all these tactics that enable this to happen. And on the outside, we have violence and sexual and physical violence. And it is the threat and the act of this that holds the whole dimension together. Coercive control, what is it? Well, it's one of these things, I think, where it's quite difficult to place. So if I ask people, do you know what coercive control is? Many people say yes. But when I ask for a definition or of an explanation, it's not quite so easy. So for me, it's sort of something that's a bit nebulous. It's not easy to hold on to. What the research says is that coercive control is an underlying dynamic that is established and maintained by physical violence. Some authors believe that it is akin to, but very different from, emotional abuse, and that it should be considered in its own right. Now, Home Office guidelines in relation to coercive control do talk about physical violence and rape and other forms of physical and sexual violence, assault, as examples of coercive control. But it's my opinion that coercive control sits much more comfortably with an emotional element of abuse than it does with a physical element. The final thing I want to say at this point about the background to coercive control is that in domestic abuse academia, there is a debate around whether or not domestic abuse is gender symmetric or asymmetric. And basically what that means is whether the same number of men perpetrate domestic abuse as women, or whether men perpetrate it more often. The feminist model is very clear that men are far more likely to be perpetrators of domestic abuse than women, and this is called gender asymmetric. Whereas family violence theorists believe that it is much more equal and that women perpetrate as often as men. There is some consistency across the theories in the literature and a recognition that coercive control is asymmetric, and whilst it may very well happen from women to men, it is more likely to happen from men to women. Given that I think that coercive control sits more comfortably with emotional abuse, I think it's important to understand how powerful emotional abuse can be. Historically, it's always been ignored in the media and often in practice. But what we know is, for years and years, women have been telling us that consequences of emotional abuse are similar to or worse than physical violence, and that overcoming the former is far more difficult than overcoming the latter. So, for example, women have told me that, their husbands have broken their arm or broken their leg or broken their collarbone, and once that's fixed, it's kind of fixed. But when you live with somebody for 10, 15, 20 years, or even 6 months, and every day, all day, they tell you that you're fat, they tell you that you're stupid, they tell you that you're ugly, that tends to be internalized, and it's very difficult to overcome that. It's very difficult to stop thinking within those parameters. The effects of emotional abuse are such that it has been likened to post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, I think this is starting to be recognised in legislation. Women talk about emotional abuse having a much greater effect in long-term relationships. So when they leave an abusive relationship and move into a long-term relationship, it's the aftermath of the emotional abuse that impacts most on their new relationships. And so what we also know, which I think is very important for us to remember in practice, is that emotional abuse indicates a high risk of physical violence in the future. And so if we're able to identify coercive control and emotional abuse relatively early on, then my argument is that we can start to put things in place and we can start to manage risk before it escalates. French and Raven were two social and industrial psychologists and were the first to identify coercive control in 1959. Now, they used coercive control as a category of power that was used largely in management or team building, and they looked at how managers managed teams and all the different forms of power that they used. In this theory, the agent threatens the survivor with negative consequences if they do not comply with demands. So the agent might be a manager who is capability managing a member of staff. In domestic abuse, the agent would be the perpetrator and the target would be the survivor. And so this dynamic would be, if you do something that I disapprove of, something bad will happen to you. The purpose in all of these situations is to obtain a desired goal or outcome. In domestic abuse, it is a deliberate intention to control, and that would be the feminist angle again. So the purpose is, I want you to do exactly as I want you to behave in the way I want you to behave. The target, that's the survivor, must believe that there will be negative consequences if they fail to conform. Because if there aren't any negative consequences, and if you're not afraid of the negative consequences, then there's no power to it, there's no weight to any threats. Surveillance, French and Raven said, is essential to know whether or not the target has complied. So first of all, they have to be frightened. And secondly, the perpetrator needs to know whether they've done what they're told or not. And in the case of domestic abuse, I think it's very important that we understand that the survivor must also be in fear. The significance of this the fear is about the perpetrator posing a credible threat. So it's about believing that this is going to happen. So coercive control is the use of various tactics to compel someone to do something or not to do something. The perpetrator's behaviours are deliberate. They pose this credible threat and they cause fear in the recipient. Now, I think it's really important to be aware of this deliberate nature, because that distinguishes perpetrators of domestic abuse from people who may be suffering from ill health. So consider a dementia patient or a person with mental health problems who's going through a crisis. Their behaviour may reflect that of coercive control, or their behaviour might be threatening and coercive. But should it be considered coercive control if it's out of character and a direct result of being unwell? I think not. So coercive control is a strategic course of conduct in which violence, sexual coercion, intimidation, isolation and control are used to dominate and exploit a partner and deprive her of basic rights and resources. And you'll see there that I've called the survivor a woman, but this can of course apply to men. This includes restricting the survivor's autonomy and freedom, forced economic dependence, isolation from family and friends, and undermining the survivor through name-calling and diminishing her self-esteem. And so what you'll see here is that the literature that talks about coercive control specifically is reflecting the power and control boot, which was designed in the 1990s before coercive control had ever been properly identified. Evan Stark is one of the leading experts in coercive control, and he wrote a book originally in the 1990s. He's a feminist. He would describe himself as a structural feminist, and his work stems from, he's a psychologist who worked with women survivors of domestic abuse. So he talked about the micro-regulation, that is the control of the everyday actions, thoughts and emotions of the survivor. And certainly as a probation officer, I came across this an awful lot in my practice. So men would tell women how to dress. They would determine how long or short their hair could be. They could determine whether or not they could wear makeup, how much makeup, what sort of makeup. One of the women I interviewed for my research was not allowed to brush her hair, for example. But also it can be much subtler than that. So it can be how they change the baby's nappies, or the way they clean the house, what detergent they use, what utensils they use, whether they use a sponge, whether they use a scour. It can be these really micromanaging everything that they do all day, every day. And this can be done overtly, so quite obviously, or it can be done in more clandestine, secretive and hidden ways. And this constant micro-regulation has an enormous impact on the everyday aspects of these women's lives. Stark describes coercive control as a condition of entrapment, and that can be hostage-like in the harms that it causes. And in fact, in his book, he does talk about how being subject to coercive control can be likened to the Stockholm syndrome. And so this is where the everyday acts and everyday unusual unpredictable acts of kindness comes in, because it builds this unusual bond between the perpetrator and the survivor, who thinks, oh, he's being nice to me today, so he loves me really. And this can mask sometimes what is the abusive behaviour. But what the coercive control does is it inflicts on the dignity, the liberty, the autonomy and the personhood of a survivor, as well as to the physical and psychological integrity. And I'm going to hopefully look at this a little bit more now and make that a bit clearer to you. When seen in isolation, coercive control is thought to be insignificant. So if you're out with your mates and your friends being coercively controlled, the chances are you won't notice it. And Stark refers to this as being invisible in plain sight. Stark's got a really good example in his book where he talks about a young woman who's part of a baseball team in America. And once a week they go out and train, and once a week they have a match. And her husband is seen by the team, or her partner is seen by the team, as one of the more supportive members of the team, extension of the team. He's always there for every practice. He's always there for every game. He gets there early. If they go he waits for her to get dressed and he takes her home. If they go out to the pub, he accompanies her, he buys all the drinks, and he's charm personified. And if it's cold, he even brings her a hoodie so that she can put her hoodie on and keep warm after the match. What's going on behind that is that he's attending all this coercive control. And so he's attending all these matches. He's getting there early. He's leaving with her because he wants to monitor what she's doing. He wants to see who she's talking to. He wants to understand who she's with. And when he hands her the hoodie because it's cold, it's not because it's cold at all. Rather, it's a symbolic gesture that she stepped out of line and she will be beaten later on when she gets home. The hoodies are there for her to hide the physical bruises that he will inflict on her later. And so we can see how it can be going on around us and we don't even know that it's happening. And so coercive control only becomes an issue to others when seen within a wider context. And one of the things that I want to discuss at the end in relation to this implications for practice and some theoretical understandings of it is how can we use mobile phones, or can we use mobile phones to help contextualize abuse? Can we find coercive control quicker if we use people's mobile phones? And I'd ask you to think about ways that you are using that in your practice. So perpetrators create a world that determines the rules and expectations of others, and they create their own reality. So you've got this micro-regulation going on. This is the way that you peel potatoes. This is the way that you brush your teeth. And this creates their own world, and survivors succumb to an alien will. So it's likely that perpetrators believe that what they think is going on is true and that their demands are normal and acceptable. That is perfectly possible. And certainly in my experience in the probation service, when I did get people to admit to what they were doing, they kind of knew it was wrong, but they also didn't know that it was wrong. And so in an effort and this becomes like a real world to them. And in an effort to manage this abuse, women succumb to what Stark calls an alien will. So they take on board the abuser's reality and live within that. And so what's really significant now, I think, is that a woman will believe the perpetrator's criticism of her. And her self-worth is not measured by her own understanding, but it's measured by the perpetrator's reactions to her. So a really good example of that for me is I once worked with somebody who, as a mother, had made birthday cake for their young child and had spent days baking the cake and making this beautiful palace and full of princesses. And this woman was absolutely delighted with the end product and thought that the cake was just the most amazing thing that they'd ever done, and was really delighted and couldn't wait to show her daughter. The husband came back and was really very abusive about the quality of the cake, that it was really rubbish, that what was she doing? She was embarrassing herself, she was embarrassing the family. And so the woman took on his reality and believed that actually this cake was rubbish, and so wasn't able to present it in the birthday party. And also the fear of the consequences of getting things wrong and making mistakes, however big, however small, leaves the woman feeling paralysed, or leaves the survivor feeling paralysed. And so she's left negotiating the ever-shifting unreality of the abuser's world and the unpredictable rules and boundaries that are constantly change. So I once worked with a perpetrator, and I'm sure that you've come across this many times in your own practice, but I once worked with a perpetrator who assaulted his wife because when he came home from work, the food wasn't on the table, ready, waiting for him. So the next day she made sure that the food was on the table, ready and waiting for him. But that night he was angry because the food was too hot. So the following day, the food was ready on the table and wasn't as hot as it was the night before. But that night, the man assaulted her because the food was too cold. And this went on and on and on until eventually one day he came home and he sat the woman down, or sat down to eat his food, made his partner sit next to him and counted every single pea on that plate. And I think what we know is that there weren't the right number of peas there. And so there's this fear that surrounds them all the time. There's this reality that the men are being reasonable, that they are insignificant, and that they are getting things wrong all the time. And this fear paralyzes them. And so the woman, or the survivor, is left negotiating these ever-shifting unrealities of the abuser's world and the unpredictable rules and boundaries that constantly change. Whatever the woman does is wrong, though, she can never ever win, because she has no control over what winning means. Slowly, with time, the woman's self-esteem is eroded. Her respect and confidence disappears until her resistance is worn down. So this is going back to the lack of autonomy that we talked about earlier on. She becomes so undermined that she's unable to make a decision, and she's almost stuck like a rabbit in headlights. She doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know what to say, because whatever's going to happen, she doesn't know how to predict him anymore. And so she becomes filled with anxiety, guilt and depression, and this fear can become overwhelming. So going back to this credible threat that we talked about earlier, and this fear. And her fear is not about what might happen, but what will happen, but about what could happen. And what we see in refugees is that very often they ask three questions. When was the first assault? When was the last assault? And what was the worst assault? And this information can give us some insight into what it is that they might be frightened of. So surveillance and monitoring, as French and Raven pointed out, surveillance and monitoring of someone's behaviour is to the extent that it deprives them of their privacy. It creates the impression that the perpetrator is both omnipotent and omnipresent. And so if we go back to the baseball match, he was always there. Even if she couldn't see him in the crowd of supporters, she knew that he was there. Even if he wasn't in the pub, she knew he was on his way. Even if she was getting change from the match, she knew that he was watching her. And so women's independence and autonomy has changed over time. Women have the vote now, women go out to work, and women have much more autonomy. And so what Stark says is that men have to change the way that they control and abuse women in order to reflect these changes. And mobile phones is one of the ways that I think autonomy and technology has changed autonomy and how perpetrators abuse. So let's look at some of the ways that some of the women talked about. And again, just to remind you, the names have been changed and I am quoting directly from them. So some of these stories might be difficult to hear. So the first thing I want to point out is that when I asked women to be involved in my research, many of them identified mobile phones as being significant in their experiences. And so what we have here is Joanna talks about how he was controlling me by phone. Everything was by phone. And she was really clear. The only reason I have accepted this interview is because I know if you, that's me, get this message out there, it will help a lot of people. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be sharing this research with you because you are the people who can make a difference. Caprice talked about it's easier, it's more convenient, it's smaller and it's faster. And this accessibility of the mobile phone, I think, is really, really significant. Okay, she said you can be on a train, you can be walking, you can be anywhere. You can see people walking with you don't see people walking with a laptop, but you do see them walking with phones, and they're holding it like that. They're walking down the street and their phones are there, and this doesn't happen with technology before that I'm aware of. Catherine says something very similar. They're just holding it in their hand, in their phone. It's like they're there every day, 24/7. Everyone has one in their hand. Because a laptop you can't put in your pocket as easily as you can with a phone. That's probably why mobile phones are such an issue, because you can just walk around with it. Whatever you feel like doing something with it, you just pull it out and do it to carry on with your day. And Catherine talked very much about how if you used a laptop, you had to turn it on, you had to wait for it to warm up, and that these few seconds give people time to calm down, give people time not to react. Whereas with a mobile phone, it's already on, it's already there. And so they were texting stuff or using their mobile phones specifically and immediately without filtering what they were going to say. And we've seen a lot of this publicity coming around in relation to social media, especially with politicians and death threats and with the general election coming up. I also want to say one more thing about the significance of mobile phones, is that some of the women got it straight away. Some of the women really understood that straight away. But I found it really, really difficult to recruit. So I'd have 10 or 15 people in a room and maybe only 1 or 2 would come forward. And so I had to change my recruitment tactics and started asking women if they would, either telling women that I was doing my research around mobile phones, but saying that I just wanted to hear about their experiences, and if mobile phones weren't being used in their abuse, that was okay because it would form a contrast and it would make my sample less biased. As a result of that, many more women came forward and I had many more women to choose from to interview, and I'd look more women. What happened was that without exception, every single woman had been abused by mobile phones. They just hadn't realised it, and many of them didn't understand that until they were in the interview. And I think this really reflects what we know about emotional abuse. Many of the women, many survivors of domestic abuse think of domestic abuse as being a physical thing. So if they've got bruises and marks on their body, then they recognise that they're being abused. But if they don't have this, then they don't. And I think this is still being reflected in technology. What the women talked about more than anything else was texting. Francesca's English was her second language. Sometimes I'm quoting them and the English isn't accurate, but that's because I'm directly quoting them. So he used to say, he used to text her and say, you're a bitch. And she said, I can't tell you the names he used to call me because it's a very shame for me. So even though he was using this language, she was the one who was feeling ashamed. Peaches would say, Peaches had been in a relationship with her husband for 13 years. But they had lived in different countries. They had an 8-year-old child together. After 18 years, Peaches came over to this country at her husband's bequest. So her and her daughter came over to live with him at his bequest. When she came over, he immediately stopped talking to her. He completely stopped interacting with her, ignored any comments that she made and stopped talking to him. And she soon became his slave, really. She used to be forced to brush his hair. She would have to feed him. She would have to clear up after him. And she would get nothing in return. The only time he would contact her would be in relation to sex. And she explained to me that if you should look on the phone and look at the messages my husband sent to me, if it's not about sex-related videos or something like that, no. If I should text him and say, what do we need for dinner, he would just ignore her. And so if there was problems with the child, she was settling into new school, he didn't want to know anything about that. All of this was just sex, all about sex. So he would send her photographs or videos of the sexual position that he would want during that in the evening. And she knew that if he said good morning or goodbye, have a nice day when he left to work, she knew that she would be raped that evening. Caprice talks about how at one stage she blocked her partner from texting. So what he did was he texted me on my landline. And so you had this lady with a voice talking, you are a bitch, I'm going to kill you. But obviously it's like a machine talking, but reading what he's text, it was very freaky. And so you can get a sense of how this fear is being portrayed through mobile phones. So Caprice's ex-partner, so voice calls were also very, very popular, not with Peaches, but with almost everybody else. So Caprice's ex-partner bought their 4-year-old daughter the most up-to-date iPhone, and he said, this is because I want to keep contact with my daughter. We've separated now. I understand the relationship is all over, but she is my child, and I want to keep in contact. But what he would do is that he would call their daughter, and then he doesn't say nothing. And because she's a child, sometimes he's not saying anything. And so because she's 4 years of age, she throws her phone down and runs off and plays with her friends, okay? But actually, he's not saying nothing. And so she constantly just leaves the phone. She leaves it in the room where her mum is, switched on. This guy, her ex-partner, could be there all day. The phone will be on. The phone would die, but he would still be there listening to my background and listening. So what she means is that he would be listening to her on the phone until the phone died. And so what her partner was doing, he was listening for voices. He was listening to see who was voices he recognised to work out where she was. Who, when, where, and for how long the participants were allowed to speak with their friends was also a very common theme. And so Francesca was only allowed to, most of them were only allowed to speak to certain people. So many people in their contact list were banned. They weren't allowed any contact with them at all. But Francesca summarises it well, I think, because she says, I can't talk too much with friends. When I talk 10 minutes, he says, stop. How long can you talk with your friends? Stop. And so if she went over the 10 minutes, he would start to shout and be abusive towards her and towards her friends. And so she often wouldn't bother phoning them. And if she did, she'd make sure it was, considerably less than a 10-minute conversation. Caprice, I think I got onto this later on. Caprice was only allowed to use the phone between 8 and 10 p.m. and then only in the garden. So in the winter months when it was snowing, if Caprice wanted to speak to somebody, she had to go and do it in the snow. Recording was also used by perpetrators. So some men use their phones to gather evidence, to disguise their abusive behaviour and shift the responsibility onto their partners. Sometimes, unable to cope with the emotional abuse, Indy would beg her husband to stop and let her return home to her parents abroad. So Indy's situation was that he would not speak to her very often other than to verbally abuse her. And that would start, and I quote her here, from morning until night. And that's all that she would do. And he would build this emotional abuse up over a period of time. And ultimately it would become physical abuse. And she'd get to the point that she would be so desperate and so lost and so worn down and so helpless that she would start crying and she would start pleading with him. Why are you doing that? Why are you doing this? And she would be begging him, please let me go home. And when she left him and told him that she was leaving, that she'd had enough, he said that he had recorded her in these states, and he would threaten her and say, I will tell the police that she's mentally upset and I'll show this is how you cry. So this is what her husband told her: if you leave me, I'll show the police, and this is evidence that you are mentally unwell. And she said the main thing he was doing throughout, he was telling me, you are mad and you are going off. And I think she meant going off your head. As a practitioner, I think if I saw these videos, I would think this is a woman who's being abused. But it hadn't occurred to Indy that her word would be taken, that people would not believe her partner. And so I think this is a part of her internalising this abuse. And I think perhaps an example of how she's taken on his reality. Nobody will believe her. People will only believe him. And it's probably worth noting that Indy came to this country alone. She came from abroad. She came alone. She did a master's degree. She was independent, autonomous and self-sufficient. And in this relationship, she became completely helpless. So we're talking about the stuff that Williamson and Stark mentioned earlier on. Another example is Josephine's partner. He would provoke her into arguments. And when she reacted, he would voice record the conversation. So what's unique about domestic abuse over all other forms, over other different types of abuse, in my opinion, is about this element of trust. So when you get involved in a relationship and you fall in love, you tell people all your secrets, you tell people your fears, because this is what being in an intimate relationship involves. What happens in an abusive relationship is that this trust is broken and all your vulnerabilities and all your triggers are identified and manipulated and exploited by perpetrators so that they can control you, they can undermine you and use your insecurities as a power dynamic tool. And so in this situation, Josephine's partner knew what to say to get a rise out of her. He knew what she didn't like to hear and what she would respond to. Josephine explains he would start the quarrel. Sometimes I talk back at him, so it was there to prove that he will record it, and then he will send it to them, and that would be her family and his family. Okay, and sometimes he would phone someone and it would be live, so she would be shouting at him because he had said something or done something, and he would be like calm itself. So she was angry, she was talking like this is what he would say, and this is what they would think, that she, Josephine, was angry, that she was talking to him like this. And so through using voice recordings, he was undermining Josephine and putting her in a situation where she looked like she was the abusive person. Photographs were also common, and so Indy's husband would self-harm, bruise himself, scratch his face, put injuries on him and take pictures of this. This is Catherine's example. So my ex-partner used to basically just stand outside my house and take pictures and send it to me. Like if I wasn't at home, he'd send me pictures saying, where are you? I'm outside your house. And this would be on a Saturday morning. She had 2 kids under the age of 5. They were in the park. You know, that's what mums do, okay? But he would stand outside, and I think that's pretty intimidating, okay? Peaches would say that he would take her phone and just go through all her photographs as if it was his phone. And this was really a common theme amongst the women, was this sort of expected belief by the men that the women's phones were theirs and that they could look at these phones whenever they want and that they had a right to do so. And Caprice talked about my phone was his phone, but his phone was his phone. I wasn't allowed any access to his phone, but he was allowed to see mine whenever he wanted. And women also talked about how men would take contracts out in their name. So women would have that. I think Joanna talked about her partner got a contract out for her and got her a phone that she may or may not have wanted. Joanne had no control or say over which phone to have or what contract to have. But of course, because the contract was in his name, he was then in charge of everything, how many free minutes she could get, all of that sort of stuff. And so Matilda talked about that Matilda wasn't allowed a smartphone for a very long time. So when she came over to this country to live with her partner, she was only allowed an old-fashioned Nokia phone and wasn't allowed to have a SIM phone at all. And eventually, her husband was embarrassed by his family, who accused him of being too tight to buy her a smartphone, and he was embarrassed by this, and so he went out and he bought her one to save face, really. And what happened then was that Matilda started taking photographs, but when she took photographs or anything like that, all the time he was taking her phone and deleting all the pictures off her phone, and he kept saying that this was because she could have more memory, that if she kept taking pictures like this, her phone wouldn't have any memory and she wouldn't be able to use it. But she didn't want him to do that. She wanted to keep her phone. So social media was also used. And we see this a lot, and a lot of the research talks specifically about social media. Government documentation, Home Office guidelines often talk about social media. There's far fewer mentions of mobile phones. And my take is that mobile phones give you access to the social media, and it's the mobile phone, I think, that's more significant because of this. So we've talked about the accessibility of mobile phones. So if you took somebody's mobile phone away, they'd have to go to a laptop to get access to social media. And I think that probably social media would be used less. Whereas if you took away social media and give people access to their mobile phones, people would be using things like WhatsApp or FaceTime to generate information and to share information in much the same way as social media. And so I just want you to when we talk about social media, I want to plant this idea in your head that actually maybe mobile phones is a more appropriate term to use. And so what we saw in this research was that perpetrators use social media to abuse women directly, but also they use social media to involve friends and family in their abuse. So he would always send me pictures, not very nice pictures, Catherine said, on Instagram, and he would just direct message them to me just so that I could see them. And Donna reflected many of the people in the research when she said that she got a restraining order against Donna, and I'll talk about Donna a bit more in a minute, but Donna got a restraining order against her partner, and because he couldn't contact her directly, because she could go to the police with that information, he got his son, who was almost an adult, not her son, his son, to friend request her on Facebook. And so I learned that there's a very, very, very thin line sometimes between all of these different types of abuse that the Home Office defines. So familial abuse is not dissimilar to interpersonal violence, which I talked earlier on about Peaches, who was involved in domestic servitude, and so that raised issues to me around modern slavery and how thin that veil was. And so I invite you again, if you're in this situation in practice, to consider what I'm saying in relation to these forms of abuse. Also, girls and gangs, I've done a seminal webinar for you before on girls and gangs, and much of what I talk about appears to be happening there as well. And so we've got all these tools that help people monitor and keep control of the women. And so the last example is tracking, and this was really common. Almost without exception, the women talked about being tracked via GPS. So Donna and her daughter, Donna, who I just mentioned now with the Facebook thing, Donna and her daughter were moved by the police to bed and breakfast accommodation. Now, in all my years in the probation service, I never came across police officers paying to house women and children to keep them safe, and I can only surmise that the danger and risk that these people were in and the danger he posed to them must have been extremely high. And so about 12 months before the relationship ended, or before Donna left the abusive relationship, her husband bought their daughter a tablet, an iPad. And this was the daughter's iPad. There was only games on it for her to play with, nursery rhymes, YouTube, everything on it was hers. Donna had nothing to do with it. She didn't want anything to do with it. She's not particularly interested in technology, but realised that it was a very good way for her daughter to learn and to develop. So they go to this B&B accommodation that the police have organised for them. And when they get there, Donna encourages the daughter to open the iPad because this is a sense of normality, a sense of safety, and to calm things down. And when the daughter turned on the tablet, as she had done 100 times before, Donna was surprised to find an alert saying that the iPad was stolen. Because of a situation, she was, fearful, panicked, in crisis, really. And so she contacted the police because she was really, really worried because this had never happened before. So the police came round, looked at the iPad and explained to her that when somebody reports an iPhone or an iPad is stolen, Apple Store locate the iPad because this got this Find My Friends kind of location app built into it. And then what Apple do is they send an email to the person who's reported it stolen, telling them where the iPad is. And so Donna's partner was able to locate Donna and her daughter through using the Apple Store. You can imagine how terrifying this must be. And in fairness, the police did then rehouse them immediately into another bed and breakfast accommodation. But GPS tracking was incredibly common. Everybody talked about it. And they didn't just mention it, they talked about it a lot. And Susie captured this really well for me. So Susie used to be a pub landlady, had been a pub landlady for most of her adult life, described herself as a once gregarious woman, very open, and I could see bits of that in the interview. She liked to laugh, she liked to joke, and she was pretty good at banter, really. But she talked about how we would track where I'd been and what I'd been doing, because you can do that with mobile phones these days. He was tracking me all the time, wherever I went. And in the end, like I said, I never went anywhere. I was just housebound unless he said I could go out. So we can see how Susie's adopting this alien will. She stopped being who she is and she's starting to be who he wants her to be. But what we also learned from the women was how it was really hard to stop the abuse. And so they left their partners, they blocked their partners on their mobile phones, they changed their mobile phone numbers, but men constantly circumvented it. And I've talked about this throughout this presentation, but I think it's worth having a slide on it here just to sort of bring this to everybody's attention. And so what we've seen is that men created fake profiles on social media. So they pretended to be somebody else. And then if it was Facebook, they tried to befriend them. Or if it was other forms of social media, they tried to follow them in some way. Catherine talked about how her ex-partner set up a fake dating profile and started courting her, if you like, online, and was trying to arrange to meet her. And it's only because her friend was talking to him online and building a relationship that she realised that this person was not who he said he was and was in fact Catherine's partner. And so she was able to, she found out before she went to meet him. Caprice has told us about how her partner used to send abusive messages to his landline. And Donna reporting the iPhone stolen to the Apple Store. Getting families and friends to get in contact via social media. They would text, they would call. Sometimes this would be done in quite an abusive way and to join in with the abuse and be part of the abuse. But very often it was very naive, It's just like, he's such a good man. I don't understand why you've left him. This doesn't make any sense to me. And it's all about coercive control being invisible in plain sight. And because they couldn't see the symbolism or the emphasis and the weight that behaviour or words or looks or gestures created, they couldn't see the abuse and the fear and the oppression within which the survivors were living. But also what Catherine's partner did, which I thought was quite clever. I mean, some of these people are very creative, and so what Catherine's partner did, every time she'd go out with her friends, he would bombard her and bombard her with texts and phone calls. And it was, many of the women talked about this, but it was almost as if as soon as they'd finished writing the text, they'd start the next text, and that's how quick the timing between each text was almost as long as it took to write the text. And so they'd been bombarded 30, 40 texts at any one time. 50, 60 texts in a minute was not uncommon. And one of Catherine's tactics to try to manage that was to turn her phone off. And it's just like, well, if I turn my phone off, at least he's not texting me and calling me and stop me having fun with my friends. But what Catherine's partner did was started contacting everybody else in that social group. So he'd already established who she was going out with, and because he had access to her mobile phone, had taken their telephone numbers from her contact list. And so he started texting them, bombarding each and every one of them with texts, bombarding each and every one of them with phone calls. Where are you? What are you doing? Who are you with? What are you talking about now? And doing that throughout the course of the evening. And the embarrassment became so much that Catherine just couldn't go out anymore. She couldn't deal with the embarrassment anymore. But you can also see how her friends might decide not to invite her anymore because it's just too much hassle, and it impedes on the evening and stops everybody from having a good time. And so Catherine, I think, captured this with, and if it's not his account he's looking from because I've blocked him, he'll just be looking from someone else's account. And so he'll still know where I am, what I'm doing. Yeah, it's just really hard to find a way to shut him out completely. And so what I think is really significant about mobile phones is this 24-hour surveillance. Because we carry them with us all the time, perpetrators can have 24-hour surveillance on their partners. And this meant that the women in my study felt that they were constantly visible and constantly being surveyed. So Joanna talks about how I felt controlled. Even when I was out, I was controlled because he would control me by texting me. Not just calling me on my phone. He would call me on my phone. He would text me on my message me. He would WhatsApp me. You see, Facebook me. So it was literally 4 places. So there would be phone calls, texts, WhatsApp, Facebook. That's 4 ways he would follow me. This surveillance could be covert or overt, and this is echoed in other studies in the US and Australia. So some men follow women, GPS tracking, without them knowing, and the first thing they know is because they've gone somewhere they're not allowed to go, and then they get into trouble when they're at home. They're verbally or physically abused. So Caprice tells us that even though I never saw him doing the things he would say after, who called you at 12 on an unknown number? So he was checking her phone to see who it was. He would question me about anything, and he'd ask me, I've told you not to be on the phone after hours, after 10 o'clock in the evening. No one should be calling your phone. And Joanna talked about I had Facebook working on my phone and he had Facebook on his phone. So her Facebook account was on his wallpaper screen, his screen, home screen, beg your pardon. Her Facebook account was on his home screen. And so every time there was a post or every time she got a message, he would see them either at the same time as her or often beforehand, because she wasn't always allowed to use her phone. And so he was constantly checking who I was talking to, what I'm posting, everything. I had no freedom. And the surveillance afforded by mobile phones left many of the women feeling like they could be seen anytime, all the time. And this constant surveillance became a powerful means in which to keep women subservient. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. So, what I did as part of my research is I reformed all the information that I've told you and realised relatively quickly how nicely it fitted into the power and control wheel. And so we've talked about how people used intimidation, Okay, so they demanded constant communication, breaking her form, which I didn't talk about, that happened a bit. Okay, they were tracking her movements via GPS, sending and demanding sexually explicit photographs. They used emotional abuse by devaluing her and degrading her, texts and calling her names, sending her Instagram images, threatening to use her recordings as evidence of her abuse. They used isolation, bombarding her and friends with texts and calls, controlling who she speaks to and when. They prevented ownership of smartphones and internet access. So that was the thing with Matilda. She wasn't allowed a smartphone, which means she didn't have internet access. All her family lived abroad. She needed WhatsApp or Skype or something for free access to the internet so that she could keep in touch with her family. And so because she didn't have this internet access, she became isolated from them. He did it in other ways as well, but that's just an example for the purposes of this. The minimising, denying and blaming is making light of her reactions and using the phone to create evidence of her abuse to you. And we saw that with Matilda, with Catherine, no, I beg your pardon. We saw that with Indy and with Josephine. So using children, so buying phones or downloading apps to track the mother, phoning young children to hear background noise, reporting child's devices stolen, and creating evidence of poor parenting. This male privilege we've talked about, using and checking her phone as if it's his, demanding explanations of where she is, dictating who she can talk to when, for how long, and insisting the phones or contract is in his name. And the economic abuse, I thought this was about internet banking. So Caprice, for example, gave an example that when she changed her landline and he couldn't send her these abusive texts via landline, what he did is he used his phone to access her bank account, and he would put 1 penny into her account. And when you put your reference bit to say why you're paying, he would send her abusive messages and threaten to kill her. Using coercion and threats, well, I think that's hopefully that's been an example throughout this presentation today, and so you can see all the different examples here, and all of that is within the context of physical violence, sexual violence, and so this threat that this might, or in fact that it does happen, is what keeps it together. But my adaptation of this in relation to mobile phones is to put this extra layer around it, this surveillance, because yes, the threat of sexual and physical violence is important, but you've got this 24-hour surveillance, so there's no let-up anymore. Once upon a time, women would have been locked in the house so that the men could keep control of where they were. That's not necessary anymore. Women can be out and about in a crowd, but they are being observed and they are still trapped. And mobile phones has changed that. That's very significant for mobile phones, I think. And so understanding survivors' responses. So, women who had experienced domestic abuse both before and after the advent of mobile phones said abuse was much worse with mobile phones. Women, as I've said, commented on their accessibility, okay, and that they were a gateway to other forms of communication such as social media. Okay, and social media can then be exploited to further harass, threaten and coerce women. And Caprice captures it by saying, I think I would feel less trapped if there weren't mobile phones, because it's due to the fact that if there were no mobile phones, people wouldn't be able to access the social media. Okay, you wouldn't be able to communicate with me and email me so freely and how you please. And she said that she felt stuck. She felt that there was no getaway. I felt my only getaway was to die, because that's how he made me feel. Peaches went to visit relatives. This is a bit scary. So this is about the fear. It's a bit scary. Peaches went to visit relatives when her husband was abroad, and they were keen that he did not know their new address. And so what happened was Peaches had family, very few family in Britain. So when she came over, about 2 weeks after she came over, her husband went to their country of origin on a holiday. Okay, so she was isolated and alone, just her and her daughter. Daughter was in school, and so she decided to go and visit her family. Her family had moved house, so she went to visit them in the new house. The family were which I think is interesting, did not want her husband to know where they lived. And so when her husband rang Peaches to see where she was, Peaches pretended that she was in the old home. So all the family and everybody having a lovely conversation, laughing and joking. perpetrator hung up, and before she could put the phone in her bag, she got a text from him with a map. And when she clicked on this map, it showed me the exact point that I was. It showed me the road that I was in, and it showed me the exact house. It showed me the street, everything, and that I was at home. And so even though he was the other side of the world, he knew exactly where she was. So the next one is entrapment. So I'm going back to the theory that I talked about earlier on. The impact of the monitoring and the control and abuse was cumulative and left the women feeling powerless, exposed and trapped. Indy, as I said, came to the UK alone, made friends and obtained a postgraduate degree. But as a result of this, she became under so much stress that she couldn't think it. She became helpless, and these are her words. Catherine again talks about how hard it is to hide yourself. He could do anything. He could put a picture, and this is what he threatened her. If you ever leave me, I'll put a picture on social media saying that you are missing, and I will get the internet and the Facebook community to find you. And that was his threat to her. And so she felt trapped. In an effort to manage the abuse, women in the study changed their behaviour and behaved in ways that they believed will please or at least not anger the perpetrator. And so these are examples of where I saw alien will. Susie, as I told you, was once gregarious and thrived off people's company. She said, sometimes I would just leave it, the confrontation, and I got so withdrawn into myself that every conversation that we would have was an argument. So I would just sit there and I wouldn't talk. I would just sit there and watch TV. She wouldn't leave the house and she wouldn't talk to him. So she was completely isolated in her life. And so here what we have is what really struck me about the women we're talking. It reminded me very much of Kafka's The Trial, where the main character has been accused of committing a crime, but he's never told what that crime is. And so he can never defend himself because he doesn't know what the crime is. He doesn't know what the punishment is going to be. And so women didn't understand this. And Joanna, I think, summarised it really well. If I'm lying, even if I'm not lying, I'm immediately a liar because I didn't answer the phone call to show him where I was or to confirm to him where I was. So I couldn't possibly be where I was. I had to be somewhere else because Donna talked about this like I'm hiding something and he wants to know what I'm hiding, but I'm not hiding anything. I just want to go out. Indy was afraid that her partner's vigils of her breaking down would result in losing her children. And so this is what I talked about earlier on, that his account would be uncontrolled and would be believed unconditionally, and that she had perhaps all of these people had entered his reality. It's almost as if Donna's request to go out was ridiculous. So a little bit of theory here. Okay, so bear with me, right? I'm going to look at the work of Bentham, Jeremy Bentham and Michael Foucault. I'm focusing more on Bentham for this one, but I will bring Foucault in a little bit. Bentham's the one on the left. Okay, so what Bentham had this idea of a panopticon, okay? And what he said was that in the centre of the prison, so he said, we should design prisons in this way. So in the centre, there is a guard tower where all the prisoners are visible at all times. So there's a guard tower and whoever's in the guard tower gets to see everybody in their cell. The walls between each cell separates the prisoners from each other and they become isolated. The prisoners are only able to see the guard tower, not the guard within it. And so they never know whether or not they're being watched. Okay, so the guard tower serves as a constant reminder that they are being permanently monitored and watched. And so, you know, it's like, oh, don't know if there's somebody in the guard tower, so just in case, we better start behaving as if we are being watched. And so the image here is a picture of Pentonville Prison. Okay, so just to give you the idea that this panopticon does exist in real life. Okay, so what happens is that prisoners don't know when they are being monitored or watched, or even in fact whether they are being watched. And as I said, prisoners start to behave as though they are always being watched. Rules, procedure, so Foucault takes this now. So Foucault takes this concept and argues that rules, procedures and regulations are used to control people and violence isn't required anymore. Prisoners become their own jailers. and eventually locks or bars are not needed. And so my suggestion is that with mobile phones have become the guard tower. The perpetrators become the guard within that tower, and the prison, once confined within walls and bricks and mortar, no longer has any geographical boundaries, because you take your phone with you everywhere, and it doesn't matter how close you are to the other person, as long as you both have your mobile phone, which we all do all the time, then they can have contact. And so what I suggest is that we have a modern day panopticon that occurs because of these mobile phones. Because of mobile phones, women have 24/7 access to women, and it gives them a sense of omnipotence. Okay, women feel permanently visible, and this is Foucault's terminology. Okay, with many believing that they were being watched, even when this was not possible. Okay, and so Joanna talks about, everywhere I go, I look behind me to see if he's there, if I'm with my friends. She talks about how I became paranoid. And I wonder, is she paranoid? Is she really paranoid? Or is she just being careful? And again, this might hint at his abuse and going into his reality. Susie talked about, even if I turned the location off, he would know where I am. He would still be able to track my phone. And so even though we know that that isn't likely or isn't even possible most of the time, she still thought that if her phone was turned off, he would know where she was, even though he would beat her because she turned her phone off. And this effect happens for years. So when I met Donna 2.5 years after the incident in the bed and breakfast, she still had tissue covering the lens of the camera. And she told me about this. And when she's telling me, she's laughing. She said, I know it's a sickness, but I put glue on it so that he can't see. And she's laughing when she's telling me. And so what I see here is this tension between part of her is still in his reality. Part of her still believes that he will find her, but as she's gaining her autonomy and getting back to herself, she realizes that this doesn't really make much sense, and so she's having this internal battle. So survivors' behaviour changed. They entered an alien will. So even when the perpetrators were not present, they would still change their behaviour, and Foucault calls this self-surveillance. So they started to behave in ways that they believed the perpetrator wanted them to behave in order to manage the abuse. Okay, they began to predict what perpetrators wanted and conformed without being asked. So when Francesca used to do night cleaning overnight and would finish work at 6:30 in the morning, she'd often hit traffic. But if she got home late, her partner would abuse her. And so she started taking videos of the traffic and sending it to her. So she was telling her partner where she was, and he wasn't even asking. But ultimately, as I've said before, nothing the women said or did was enough. And I don't want people to think that it's really important to me that nobody here thinks that these women are very passive and that they just took on this new identity, if you like, and they started behaving, because actually all of them are really incredibly strong and powerful women. So they had all resisted the abuse. And Foucault says, where there is power, there is resistance. Okay, and they all resisted the abuse. By virtue of the fact that they were in a refuge, they had resisted that abuse. And I recognise that my sample was swayed in that sense. But also they defied their partners. Catherine did turn off her mobile phone. Okay. Joanna and Caprice just decided, that's it, I'm done, I'm going out, I want to be with my friends. I know I'll have to answer for it later, but I don't care, I need a night out. And so they went out. Francesca took a knife to her partner and said, it's me or it's you. If you don't stop, I will kill you. Peaches and Donna took up criminal prosecutions, and Matilda's example I thought was really interesting for me, and I spent a lot of time analysing this concept of enough is enough. So about 6 months after the last physical assault, there'd been emotional abuse, but there hadn't been a physical assault, and it was a bad physical assault. She had broken bones and things, but it was 6 months later that she woke up at 7 o'clock one morning and I thought, right, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. Enough is enough. And she picked up her phone, she went outside, she called the police and told them to come and get her. She hadn't packed her bags, she didn't even take a passport. The police came and took her to a refuge, and that was the end of that. So there was no obvious trigger for her to leave, which I think had always been my assumption, that women would leave because they were afraid. But this isn't the case in this instance. And so we come to the last bit now of my presentation, where I've got some ideas about practice, but as I say, I'm really interested to know what you've got to say. So these are just some of my thoughts here. And so I think that we can use mobile phones to provide a context for the abuse, or provide a context for other behaviour, so that it's not hidden in plain sight anymore, or invisible in plain sight. Okay, it becomes hidden rather than invisible. So I think we all, if we're not doing it already, we should all now be asking questions about mobile phones, how they're being used, asking the survivor and asking the perpetrator. We need to be clear about who provided the mobile phone. And if the man provided it, if the perpetrator provided it either to the children or to the survivor, then have they downloaded any apps? Are there any location? Are there any tracking devices on there? I think multi-agency working could also be really interesting, because we compare the perpetrator's accounts with that of the survivor and see how the phone is being used and see where the gaps are and fill in those gaps. It'll provide a context for her. What is he telling her? What is she telling us that he isn't? What is he hiding? Also, if they are separated, is he still contacting her? Has she changed phone? Is he finding out about these phones? And this didn't come up in my research per se, but I did think about the use of photographs and how these might be used to establish the survivor's whereabouts. So, for example, if I was a survivor of domestic abuse and my train was cancelled and I was worried about getting home late, this is drawing a bit on Francesca's experience, would I take a photo of myself standing next to a sign saying that the train had been cancelled to prove that I would be late? Would that be a way that I would use my mobile phone to manage that abuse? I think if we're working with perpetrators, we can use mobile phones to focus on the perpetrator behaviour. So if he's deflecting or telling us that it was nothing or that it's not a big deal, we can use the mobile phone as a vehicle to discuss what he's done in terms of monitoring and controlling, and to discuss whether or not this is appropriate behaviour. We can consider how the perpetrator's use of the mobile phone with the survivor compares with others in his peer group, and we can use that to hold him accountable. So how often does he contact his mum? Is that 2 or 3 times a day? If he contacts his partner 27 times a day, then we've got a stark difference there. If those texts are abusive, we've got a context there. Okay, so it provides opportunities potentially to highlight perpetrator choices to be abusive and controlling. You don't have to text her 30 times in an hour. You can trust her that she is where she says she is. And then I think this is my last slide of my presentation. So we can use this when we're working with women as well, and we can talk to them about how the perpetrator has used the mobile phone. So if women don't realise that they're being abused, if survivors don't realise that they're being abused, we can use the mobile phone to show them the ways that perhaps they have been abused. We can talk about mobile phone use and how it's impacted on the survivor's daily routine. Do they self-surveillance now? Do they keep looking over their shoulder? Do they feel paranoid? Do they feel safe even in public spaces? Okay, and we can help her perhaps to recreate her reality and to see that her experience is of his abuse and that her reactions are normal within these situations. We can take a strengths approach. We can talk about how survivors have managed this, their resilience, their ability to cope with all of this, and use this as a foundation for them to build their independence and autonomy. And finally, I thought that maybe we could use mobile phones as a strategy for survivors to manage and keep records of the abuse. we can work with them, we can build trusting relationships with them as professionals to empower them to be able to take this matter further if that's what they want to do. So thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope it's been interesting and I hope it's been useful. Please do ask any questions, or if you want to debate anything, please don't hesitate to let me know. I do want to tell you though that on the 5th of December I'm organising a seminar on coercive control. It's called Contextualising the Invisible, which hopefully that title will make sense to you now. And where it's on Thursday the 5th of December from 5:30 until 8, London South Bank University. I'll be presenting. We've got Lindsay Dearlove, from the lead for the UK Says No More campaign. We have Rhiann Lewis, who's a solicitor at Hall Luggets, and she's an expert on domestic abuse, and we'll be having a survivor talking about their experience of coercive control. I think the Eventbrite link is going to go on, the Eventbrite link is going to go on the web pages so that you can access it there, and it is free, and it would be lovely to have you there to share your experiences with us. I've got some questions here. Alice has asked, how do you start rebuilding confidence and reshaping the routines and things that they see as normal behaviour? I think slowly is the short answer to that, is that it's done very, very slowly. Personally, I would start with building their self-confidence and self-belief. I think it's about starting on their autonomy, that they can do things, and it's very often the very, very small things that they do that you can build on. So I just think you go at their pace, and and whatever they're comfortable doing, just take it that little bit further. Thank you for saying that this omnipresence is so true. I mean, I thought so when that penny dropped for me. I was just like, I couldn't believe nobody thought of it before, really. So thank you. I'm really, really glad to hear that resonates with all of you out there. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you're still out there. And hopefully see you on the 5th of December. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.